here the sun, in Belgrade, the sun is already down. Many thanks to Petro and the organizers. I will skip the introductions and the information all the participants by now, I think, know well about the question Q&A box and unmuting and muting their mics. So let me just briefly introduce myself. I'm Vlada Stanković. I'm professor of Byzantine Studies at the University of Belgrade. And it gives me a great joy and pleasure to be able to share with you and introduce and share the session about Panos Sophoulis' latest book called Banditry in the Medieval Balkans, 800 to 1500. I will give myself just 1 minute to briefly introduce the book before giving the floor to Panos, and just would like to mention a few things that made the greatest impression about the book on me. The first one is the breadth of the source material. Byzantine sources, Slavic sources, and when I say Slavic, I mean medieval Serbian and Bulgarian sources, and also especially the law books from the Slavic world. The second one is above national. Well, this book, being the first of the kind, is highly innovative. That is I think, one of the main things that I will, even in the later Q&A session, I would like to stress. So it's above national approach, something that it's very much needed when one studies medieval Balkans. And one part of this innovative approach is leaving aside and finally abandoning the outdated concepts about Byzantine feudalism and centrifugal and centripetal tendencies and similar reductionist approaches. Before saying also just giving you a few information about the book, let me mention you just briefly the main points from Panos Sophoulis' professional biography. Panos Sophoulis received his doctoral degree from Oxford University in 2005 and is now an assistant professor of history at the Faculty of Slavic Studies of the University of Athens. His academic interests cover a wide range in the field of medieval studies. His first monograph, Byzantium and Bulgaria, 775-831, was published by Brill and is considered one of the most important contributions to the subject. Panos received the 2013 John D. Bell Book Prize for this monograph. And in addition to this monograph, and one we'll be hearing more in a few seconds, he has edited several volumes focusing mainly on the history and culture of the Southeastern Europe during the Middle Ages, and I would say especially Slavic world. He's currently preparing a study on the history of the Balkans between 1355 and 1459. The book, as I already mentioned, Banditry in the Medieval Balkans, 800 to 1500, was published by Palgrave Macmillan Publishing House in a series New Approaches to Byzantine History and Culture. And I think I made myself sufficiently clear already in this introduction that I think the book is actually very good representative for new approaches to Byzantine and medieval Balkan history. We need much more innovative works. And without further delaying and further ado, I would ask Panos to take the floor, and I will take it from the backside when he finishes his presentation. Panos, you have the floor.
Thank you, Vlada, for the very kind words and for a very, very nice introduction. I'd also like to thank Petros for organizing this very innovative and interesting session, the book festival. I have prepared a small PowerPoint presentation where I'm just showing the main points of my book, and I will try to share it now. I would like to you to let me know if you can see it. Can you all see it?
Yeah,
Fine.
I will answer. Yeah.
I guess I should start by pointing out that the incentive for undertaking my research on medieval bandits was how little do we know for and how little has been written on Balkan banditry, which by all accounts constituted a very significant problem in the Balkan countryside for a very long period of time. So there are plenty of references to bandits, but we actually know very little about it. And this is something that scholars know and recognize. They have recognized the problems which bandits caused in the Balkans, but so far no study has given any attention to the brigands themselves, to their origins, to their reasons for taking up banditry, and of course to the steps taken by central governments in the Balkans to control this problem. So I should point out that the aim of this book is exactly to address these problems and this way to shed fresh light into the social history of the region. So as I already pointed out, there are plenty of references to bandits and banditry in the Balkans in all types of sources, histories, letters, hagiographical text. Most of these accounts do not provide sufficient information. They just mention bandits operating in one region or another region. However, there's an exception. There's a very important source which enables us to understand the phenomenon much better. And this is, of course, the state archives of Dubrovnik, where one finds hundreds of reports, literally hundreds of reports, and lawsuits and court cases that date from the 14th and the 15th century mainly. These lawsuits concern cases of banditry that mainly took place in the roads connecting Dubrovnik on the Adriatic coast with the Balkan hinterland. And these reports contain valuable information for the understanding of the phenomenon. They contain the names of the transgressors, they contain the list of the goods seized by them, and they therefore provide very important insights into the organization and activity of bandit groups in the region. So overall, if we consider all the available evidence, all the written sources that we have in our hands, we can understand it's quite clear that banditry was not just a problem, banditry was endemic in many parts of the Balkans for long periods of time. What were the consequences of this phenomenon? Well, they were quite important, especially in the countryside. They disrupted communications and trade, and could severely undermine the productive capacity in the countryside. So this is basically the reason one wants to find out more about the problem, examine the phenomenon even further. So one question that naturally arises is who became a bandit and why? And I guess one explanation is, of course, poverty. Poverty played a very important role in driving a part of the rural population of the Balkans into banditry. And one must bear in mind here that only a very small part of the Balkans was suited to agriculture, that popularity density was in the ascendancy from the 10th century onwards, and this of course created enormous land pressures. And of course, we must not forget that natural disasters and various forms of social and political disruption precipitated by warfare added to the precariousness of life. So there are plenty of reasons why one had no other choice but to become a bandit. So poverty was one reason, but interestingly, economic growth and prosperity was another reason that drove a part of the population in the Balkans to banditry. So the book presents archaeological evidence from rural sites in the Balkans, from Byzantine Macedonia and Thrace, from Serbia and Bulgaria, that point out exactly to a considerable economic growth that seems to have continued well into the 13th and 14th century. This growth was based on trade. So trade was very important in the High Middle Ages in the Balkans, and this in turn trade led to a more intensive use of land communications. Land communications were mainly used by merchants who were carrying all sorts of commodities along regional and local roads. So I guess one main conclusion from all this is that the intensification of Balkan banditry coincides in time with the rapid development of trade and the subsequent growth in travel. Banditry became especially widespread between the 12th and 15th century, as more people used the overland routes, and the number of brigands operating along the way was also bound to grow. It's a natural phenomenon. But a main point that I'm trying to answer in the book is who and why, who became a bandit and why. The research has identified four main groups of people who, for one reason or another, were pushed into banditry. Peasants and herdsmen, shepherds, represent the primary sources of the phenomenon in the medieval Balkans. This is not a surprise. During times of political and military unrest, which were marked, of course, by a decline of living conditions in rural areas, banditry became a very attractive option for a segment of the rural population, especially for peasants who were hard-pressed by the systematic devastation of their land, by taxation, and by the limited opportunities for good employment. So peasants are an obvious example. Many of them, during times of political crisis and unrest, had no choice but pursue banditry. The second group are herders, shepherds, who, in contrast to peasants, carried a reputation throughout the Middle Ages of being habitually engaged in rural violence. This is not a surprise. The pastoral way of life encouraged aggression, also encouraged the willingness to resort to violence. Flocks, for example, and pastures required protection, which could only be achieved, of course, through the use of arms. Raiding neighbors for livestock or agricultural goods was often unavoidable, and this had the effect of making shepherds skilled in planning and executing small-scale military activities. Likewise, herders valued personal courage and honor, and this, of course, reinforced their martial traditions. So, the evidence that we can draw from the state archives of Dubrovnik especially reveal a great deal about the inner workings of this rural and especially the pastoral world, and especially the segment of this world which engaged into banditry. I was able to, from the sources that I was able to examine, I was able to discover that attacks were typically carried out by members of an extended kin network, which was made up of both blood and marriage relations. This is especially relevant in Vlach communities throughout the Balkans, both in the Adriatic coast, also in the south, also in the Balkan interior. So extended kin networks played a very important role, and it was upon these networks that bandits usually depended for support and protection. And of course, there are various mechanisms with which loyalty and cooperation between the members of these networks were reinforced or forged. But apart from peasants and herdsmen, there are two other groups, two other categories of brigands which have been identified, two other professional groups that very frequently engaged into brigandage. One of them is soldiers. Soldiers were usually driven to crime into two contexts. While on campaign, where the generally poor conditions of service, especially in the high Middle Ages, produced low morale and indiscipline. The second context is outside the military environment. The limited opportunities offered to soldiers after their active service, played a role in them choosing to live as brigands. So soldiers is a very important group. It's the third group, professional group, let's say, of people engaged into banditry. The fourth group, active involved in brigantines, consisted of men of generally higher social standing. In contrast to soldiers, shepherds, and peasants, these men had considerable wealth and power and committed crimes which very often went unpunished because of the important role they played in the political and military affairs of their age. So basically 4 groups: peasants, herders, soldiers, and members of the nobility were the main culprits for banditry in the Balkans during this period. What about the victims? This is something else that the study is trying to identify. Who were the victims of the attacks of bandits? Practically, any person on the road represented a target for highwaymen. And this is confirmed when we look at the occupational categories of those attacked. The victims came basically from every social or professional backgrounds, from members of the nobility, lay or ecclesiastical officials, merchants, to peasants, artisans, monks, hermits, and slaves. Practically everyone on the road was in danger of being attacked by brigands during this period, especially during the 12th to 15th century, 14th century especially. So practically everybody on the road was in danger. Because of this, state authorities in the Balkans, in Byzantium, in Serbia, in Bulgaria, and the Adriatic city-states, tried to introduce a number of measures to control this problem. And this is a question that the book is trying to address in chapter 5. The efforts of the authorities focused on 3 aims: to prevent criminal activity, to punish bandits, and to protect civilians. What kind of measures were taken? Legislation, of course, was very important, especially in Serbia, but there's also evidence from other states as well. The creation of locally based police bodies in the countryside, as well as the construction of fortified structures, watchtowers in the countryside, were among the measures taken by Balkan authorities to prevent the phenomenon. Overall, we can conclude that these measures did not act as a very effective deterrent to banditry. The reports keep on coming, so the problem actually was not reduced as a result of these measures taken by the authorities. 2 more points I'd like to make in this brief presentation. In the penultimate chapter, I tried to place banditry within a broader European context. And what I tried to do is try to compare the evidence we have in the Balkans with that coming from other European states. And this comparison actually, and interestingly, revealed very similar patterns of criminal behavior. Just as in the Balkans, large parts of Western Europe were plagued during the Middle Ages by crime and public disorder, which were exacerbated during periods of political, military, and social unrest. Again, as in the Balkans, the weight of the burden imposed on peasants during wartime, as well as heavy demographic pressures and natural disasters, were some of the reasons for the rise of banditry among the rural population. Quite the same way, the evidence pertaining to the involvement in criminal activities of soldiers and members of the nobility is comparable to that of the Balkans. The phenomenon is especially obvious in England, in 13th and 14th century England, where members of the nobility distinguished themselves for their involvement in criminal acts, in criminal behavior. So there's a pattern, and there are many similarities between the 2 worlds during that same period. Now, the book comes to a close with a reference to banditry in popular legend. It's quite natural that the intensity of the problem of banditry accounted for the fascination of medieval men and women with tales of outlaws. The outlaw hero tradition is evident, of course, in England, where the first of such figures appear as early as the 11th or the 12th century. Robin Hood, of course, is the most obvious example. I think he first appears in the 13th century. But interestingly, a similarly rich old tradition of ballads and heroic songs that celebrated the deeds of real or fictitious outlaws is clearly attested in the Balkans from the early Ottoman period, let's say from the 15th or mainly from the 16th century. So these are highly, the heroes, the protagonists of these ballads are romanticized fighters of freedom, for freedom and justice, who gradually came to symbolize the spirit of resistance to an oppressive foreign rule. So although the evidence, we don't have evidence of such tales from the Middle Ages, there's a good reason to believe that some of these tales may have actually originated during the Middle Ages. So overall, I'm coming to one, wishing to come.
Let's conclude, Pano.
I'm concluding. I'm just saying that I think there's still more room for research. I think this was a first step, and I will be very happy to hear comments and answer to questions on the book. Thank you very much.